We're continuing our study of Shabbat, and we have covered the basic commands. There is one other basic command that we need to cover, and that is the time period. And then we'll start getting into some applications. The time period is from evening to evening. This is mentioned originally in Genesis 1. If you look at verse 5, it says, "And evening and morning were the first day." And this is also assumed in Passover. Passover, you have the preparation of the meal is not on a Shabbat, it's on the 14th. And then it's eaten on the Shabbat of the 15th, which is the first day of unleavened bread. And it says that you prepare it that afternoon and you eat it in the evening, meaning after sunset. This is also mentioned in Leviticus 23:5. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover, meaning that at the end of the day, when it becomes twilight, that is when you're going to celebrate the meal. In Leviticus 23:32, talking about a different holiday, "It shall be to you a Shabbat of solemn rest. You shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Shabbat." This is talking about Yom Kippur, which is on the 10th of the month, okay? But on the 9th of the month at evening, meaning at the end of the 9th day, when it's sundown, that is when you start your day. So we see this in a lot of different places in the scripture. If you look in the notes, there's a lot of places where this idea is assumed. So evening to evening, sunset to sunset is what we're talking about. The next thing that I wanted to talk about Shabbat is, does the Shabbat apply to Gentiles? Now, this is a very important question because it has a lot to do with discipling and when you implement the Shabbat rules with a group of converts. Okay, people who have a Gentile background, they're not familiar with Shabbat. And so when do you implement this becomes the question. Now, in Acts 15, verses 19 through 21, it gives us 4 commands that you have to agree to right up front. 3 of those commands have to do with the diet because of the fact that you are now eating together. Okay? But what is excluded in that is the things that Gentiles generally understand, such as murder. Okay? So we're assuming those things also, and when you add up all of those things, you get basically the 10 commandments minus 1 commandment. And that 1 commandment that is missing in that whole thing is Shabbat. And so we're saying that Shabbat is not required of brand new Gentile converts. Okay? So, but, the big but, in verse 21, it says, on Shabbat, you can study the Torah at synagogues, which are all over the place. Okay? In other words, the point that he's making is that those are the things you start with, and then you need to study the Torah on Shabbat, on Saturday. Okay? So, what does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean that they have to stop working on that day, but it does mean that they have to come to a meeting on Saturday to study the Torah. Well, this lines up with how Shabbat is presented in the Torah. The first time you get a command to rest on Shabbat, to not do any work, is in Exodus 20, right? But it says at the beginning of the command, remember the Shabbat. In other words, it's assuming that you already know about Shabbat. Well, how is that possible if the first command is just being given at Sinai in Exodus 20? Well, we can go back to Exodus 16. In Exodus 16, it says you're not supposed to cook on Shabbat. So he's making a special rule about Shabbat. And again, he is assuming that you already know about Shabbat somehow. Okay? Well, in the command in Exodus 20, if you go down to the bottom of the command, it talks about the fact that God rested on the seventh day. And in other words, he's saying that Shabbat is assumed from this original event that you find in Genesis 2, which is at the end of the creation story of Genesis 1. So God rests on that day and he makes it holy. Okay? But there's no command in there to not work on Shabbat. There is no command in there for us to do Shabbat. Okay? But because of the fact that God made this day holy, well, that assumes that we are supposed to do activities with God on this day. Okay? So, but it assumes it, which means that what we're talking about is a tradition. So you have a tradition of Shabbat where you have activities with God, in other words, studying Torah and other activities that you would do with God. And this is a tradition. It's not a command. Until you get to Exodus 20, then it changes from a tradition to a command. And that's the same thing that happens for new Gentile converts. They start learning the Torah on Shabbat, and then and that becomes a tradition. And then as they go along in their study of Torah, they're going to eventually run into Shabbat, which is what's happening right now with us. People are asking about it. And so we're studying Shabbat. And so once we have this study in place, then we can go ahead and start applying it to our lives. And so it happens at some point after becoming a new disciple. And so, does Shabbat apply to Gentiles? The answer is yes and no. Okay, it's kind of a gray area that you need to navigate, and we just explained how that is. All right, so those are some basic additional information about Shabbat, and in our next video we're going to start getting into some applications of the Shabbat commands. So we have to do it from sundown to sundown, and we have to learn about it gradually before we implement it as Gentile converts. But we're going to need to study on Shabbat the Torah.